Are you a footballer who wants to maximize your performance to succeed at the top level? My new ebook, Strength and Conditioning 101 for Female Footballers, is now available. For free and instant access, simply head on over to jacobandre.com. Link is in the show notes. The Women's Footy Podcast is brought to you by FitnessWorks. With 3 convenient locations in Darwin at Darwin City, Nightcliff and Allawa, these gyms are world-class family exercise centres offering the latest equipment with friendly and fully qualified staff. For more information, check out fitnessworksnt.com.au. G'day and welcome to the Women's Footy Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Andre, and today I'm talking about how you can improve your speed and explosiveness on the field. Now, how I always start is to say that everything is underpinned by strength. So when it comes to strength and conditioning, if we were to compare that to what came first, the chicken or the egg, we could argue until we are black and blue in the face over whether the chicken or the egg came first. Now, it doesn't matter in this case, it's just the analogy. And it's the purpose is to get you to understand that when we talk about strength and conditioning in the same way, there is one that comes first, and it's strength. Conditioning comes second. Now, one of my most frustrating things is when I see people just doing all the conditioning, prioritizing and focusing on that first and foremost, or simply only doing that with no consideration for the strength. And so what this might look like is seeing someone out there on the field, on the track, at the beach, wherever, doing running, sprint training, plyometric training, like sort of jumping around, doing repeat sprints, doing interval work, 200s, 300s, 400s, or just going for long runs. Where they're going wrong, those people, is they need to prioritize the strength. So it is so super important that you have the strength first, which is going to underpin your ability to be able to do what you're asking of your body. And that is your sprint training, your repeat sprints, your interval running, your long distance endurance running. Now, there's a third one which comes in here, and it actually sits in the middle, and that is running mechanics or technique when it comes to any running-based sport like football. So we've got strength first, then we have technique or mechanics, then we have conditioning. The strength is going to, as I've already touched on, give you the strength to be able to do what you're asking of your body in the conditioning, in all that running. Or it could be bike riding or swimming, but it's a running-based sport, so I'm just going to focus on running here. Not to say that the cycling and the swimming isn't good. That's highly beneficial, especially the swimming, but that's for another topic. But the strength is also going to give you the ability to do what you're asking of your body in the mechanics. So you need to run mechanically efficient. So if you want to improve speed and explosiveness, number one is developing the strength. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. Number two is you need to work on your mechanics to make sure that you are moving efficiently or mechanically correct so that you can maximize the force that you're creating and use that strength that you've developed. And then from there is to then work on the conditioning, which is going to be your different elements of stuff, which is going to be your sprint training, which can be broken up into 3 different areas: acceleration, top end speed, and deceleration, as well as your agility or change of direction. Those 2 things are different. Change of direction is where you change in response to a stimulus, and agility is where, change of direction is where you change in a predetermined manner, and agility is where you change in response to a stimulus. So for example, change of direction, you lay the cones out. Coach says, I want you to run to this cone, then turn 90 degrees to this cone, then turn 45 degrees, and then sprint through the last 10 meters. So that's where you're sprinting and changing direction in a predetermined manner. You don't need to make any decisions. You know what you're doing. You just got to get through those cones. Agility is where typically you might be copying someone or mirroring somebody. And so you might have a 5 by 5 meter box, and you have a partner on one side. They're going to move laterally, forward and back in different ways. It may just be simply left and right, forward and back. It may be in other directions as well. And you're trying to copy them. So you are responding to that stimulus. You are responding to what they're doing. And so you don't know what's coming, and you just need to act and respond. And so that is where there requires some thinking to it. So because you're constantly going, I need to go follow them left, I need to follow them right, I need to come forward, I need to go back, whatever it might be. Then from there, you've got your repeat sprints. So that's your ability to be able to sprint up one way, whatever distance it might be, 10 meters, 20 meters, 40 meters, and then sprint back. And then that helps you with your gut running, for example, where you're pushing up forward because your team's got the ball, you're going to attack, or no, there's a turnover, and now we need to push back and defend. And then maybe even a third time. So a lot of the training I do in Footy Fit is we do a two-way one and a three-way one where we sprint up and then back, and another one where we sprint up, back, and up again. Then we've got our interval training, which is generally our speed endurance, and this might be generally between 200 and 400 meters. Sometimes there's a little bit of stuff around the 150 mark, but generally it's 200 to 400 meters. And then you've got your aerobic training, which is your long runs, but this is where we can get off our legs. And if we look at what we're trying to achieve out of our aerobic training, we can jump in the pool and we can actually do some pool sessions, which kind of saves our legs a little bit. Not to say that we shouldn't be doing long runs. It's really important and it's valuable to do the long runs, but we can do other things as well. And if we just simply want to develop aerobic endurance, then being in the pool is a great way to do that. So that's your conditioning. You've got your running mechanics that are going to help you to become more fast and explosive. Before that, we've got our speed. So we need, our strength. So we need to look at our strength training. Now, it's really important that you do build a base. And base training for football in Footy Fit is 6 months. You can do that as 2 different programs, program 1, which is 3 months, and program 2, which is 3 months. A lot of people, particularly at the sub-elite level, like to only do 3 months leading into a season because they've got other things going on. They're playing other sports or they're playing in other leagues around the country. So if we do, though, the preseason one, that's really foundation building, and it develops that hypertrophy, which is increasing muscle size, which is important for football, as well as muscular endurance. And that's the muscle's ability to be able to endure and continue to contract and do that ongoingly. From there, we then move into that preseason 2, where it becomes a little bit more about still developing the hypertrophy, but a bit more about the strength, and then moving into the in-season, which is generally about 6 months. In season 1 being a 3-month program, and in season 2 being an in-season program. So, which is 3 months, each of them being 3 months. All up, we've got 12 months there. So in the in-season, we really get real specific and real fast and powerful with all of our stuff that we're doing. So whether that's in the gym, in the strength exercises we're doing in the gym, or in the conditioning that we're doing, which is going to be your sprints, for example. Now, if we can start from the beginning in preseason, then that gives us the foundation to be able to build on, to be able to do that other stuff better later. And so it dramatically reduces the risk for injury rather than just going into that without having that foundation built beforehand. But when it comes to strength, it's really important with the legs that we are developing that strength initially, and then the muscular endurance through that strength, that hypertrophy, and then from there, the more pure strength, and then more into the power. So I touched on plyometrics being something that people do without giving much consideration for strength. That isn't always the case, but what I see is people doing plyometrics and they're not actually ready for that. True plyometrics is really, really challenging. It's essentially, here's an example of an exercise that's plyometric, jumping off a box onto the ground with minimal contact on the ground and up onto another box on the other side. When I see people do this, often if you don't have the underpinning properties, the strength to be able to handle that, it ends up not becoming so plyometric. So what you'll see, for example, with a drop jump, you've got a drop jump and a depth jump. Here's probably the best way to explain it between these two exercises. A depth jump is where you drop and you go down for depth. So you go into a squat and then you jump up the other side. A drop jump, there is no bending of the knees. It's straight down, hit the ground, keep the legs locked, and up the other side. It's purely tendons. And this is where you need to develop if you want to become more powerful and explosive. And this is what really the true meaning of plyometrics is all about. So while depth jumps are good, they're kind of like a prerequisite, in my opinion, and the way I use them in Footy Fit, to then a depth jump, which would be later in the season, come in season 2. so that we're really peaking come finals time and we're really fast and explosive. But there's got to be some stuff even before the depth jumps. And so that generally is that basic strength. So inside preseason 1 and then preseason 2, we do a lot of muscular strength training. We do some plyometrics, and that plyometrics is simply pogos. Now, pogos are where you're just bouncing on the balls of your feet. And the cue that I like to use is I want you to put your hands on your hips. And then from there, and you can do this right now along with me if you like, probably not if you're driving, pull over and have a go, or save this for later, but listen to it now so you've got an idea of what it's about. So that's to put your hands on your hips and pretend that your pelvis is a bucket of water filled all the way up to the brim. And any movement of that bucket is going to spill water out of the bucket. Now, with your hands on your hips, I want you to think about tilting your pelvis forward so that you're tipping water out the front of your bucket. Nothing else moves, only your pelvis. So what a lot of people will do here is they'll start to lean forward. I don't want your upper body coming forward. All I want is your pelvis to tilt forward. Then from there, I want you to tilt your pelvis back. So you're trying to think about tipping water out the back of the bucket. Do that 3 times. It'll start to feel like you're learning how to twerk. And if that's what it looks like and what it feels like, then you're probably doing the right thing. So from there, what we want to get is the pelvis into a neutral position. Often in my experience, we need to get people to err on the side of posteriorly tilting the pelvis, which means tipping the pelvis backwards or tipping water out the back of the bucket. And then from there, we're in a strong position. And if you touch your gut, it should be rock solid. You should be tensing your abs as if someone's going to punch you in the gut. From that position, from that really strong braced position through the abs and with the pelvis in a mechanically strong position, tipping water out the back of the bucket, we can then go down to our feet. So what I want you to do first, and I highly recommend doing this in shoes to begin with and on a hard surface, whether it's concrete or an athletics track, you can do it on the ground. You can do it on dirt or grass. And especially if you're doing it barefoot, it's probably nicer on your feet to do that. But having that really like reactive surface is going to be beneficial and much more easier, especially to begin with. And people might say, well, it's going to hurt my shins, it's hurt my knees. You just need to reduce your load. And it might only be a couple of pogos. But doing this on a hard surface to get that reactivity is going to be really beneficial and effective to begin with, and ultimately throughout the whole way of doing this. So in this case, right now, we've got good shoes on. So with your shoes on, I want you to think about pulling your toes up into the top of your shoes and spreading your toes within your shoes. So you're really trying to spread your toes apart. With your toes up and spread, I now want you to roll up onto the ball of your foot with your heel just off the ground, but as low to the ground as possible without touching the ground. So we're not right up on our toes, we're on the ball of our foot. Our heel is off the ground, but it's only off the ground so minimal that it's any lower and it would be touching the ground. Now in that position, you're probably falling over because of balance. So now in that position, keeping everything locked, the ankles, the knees, the hips, and the core, the abdominals through the trunk, I want you to bounce up and down. You may need to bend your knees a little bit to get that first one going, but after that, this is about keeping everything locked. Nothing is bending. This is not bending at the knees. This is not a jump squat. The knees stay locked. And if we go through again from the core down to the hips, down to the knees, down to the ankles, everything stays locked. And the most important one here, the most important joint that is locked are the ankles. Keep those ankles locked, because the more you can keep those ankles rigid, the faster and more explosive you are going to become. I had the pleasure, side note here, and a little bit of modesty aside here, just sort of bragging. I had the pleasure, and this is also just to reinforce to you that I know what I'm talking about when I say this stuff, because I've had these conversations with some of the world's best coaches on sprinting and explosiveness. So had the pleasure of speaking to Franz Bosch. Now, you may have heard of front side mechanics, positive side running, Bosch mechanics, whatever term it might be. It comes after Franz Bosch. And I've had a conversation with lots of strength and conditioning coaches on this podcast, including Jared Kay, Nathan Kiley. Jared Kay is obviously with Richmond Tigers in the AFL, and Nathan Kiley with Brisbane Broncos in the NRL. And we've discussed about not becoming too Bosch, not overdoing it with the Bosch mechanics. And that's true. But these principles are basic principles that I want to talk to you about. And in this conversation that I was very lucky to have with Franz Bosch, I asked him what was probably the main stuff that he would focus on, and he said it's all about the ankle. The more you can keep the ankle joint rigid and locked, because you're going to get that reactivity then, the faster an athlete is going to become and the more explosiveness they're going to come. And there was a video that I shared on Instagram in the podcast interview with Jared Kay, and it was of George North, who was a British Lions rugby union player. He's running, and he's in some tour of the British Lions were in a tour of Australia. They were playing against Australia, and I'm pretty sure the player was Lottie Takiri. And Lottie Takiri goes to tackle George North, and George North gets down, and he kind of ends up, because he's so strong through his core, his hips, his legs, he's able to, Lottie Takiri ends up on his shoulder, and he sort of charges forward for about 5 steps with Takiri, I've seen him in the gym personally, lifting 160 kilo bench press. The guy is a machine. The guy is massive. And George North runs with him like it's just like a 20 kilo sandpack on his shoulder. It's incredible. And I asked friends who worked with the British Lions rugby union team, and George North in particular, how he was able to do that. And he said, man, I think it just comes down to, in my opinion, ankle rigidity. It comes down to making your athletes strong and rigid in the ankle joint, because with a strong and rigid ankle joint, you can then move fast linearly in a straight line. And it also gives them the ability to be able to change direction laterally or in any direction they choose to. Now, here's some stuff that I've played around with over the years, and that is getting athletes up onto the ball of the foot. And then from there, thinking about being on the inside when you're in a ready sort of athletic stance position, kind of having your feet relatively wide in a comfortable width, but relatively wide, wider than hip width apart. And with your feet, so you're rolling up onto the ball of your feet, and then having your feet a little bit wider than shoulder width apart, hinging at the hips, so slightly leaning forward in a nice strong position with your core through the hips, is to then roll onto the inside of your big toes. And by being on the ball of your foot, erring on the side of your inside of your big toes, it gives you the ability to move very quickly in any direction, particularly laterally, which a lot of people are typically not reactive or ready for. So if you're standing up straight away, you're not in a stable position. So getting down low, having your feet wider gives you a wider base of support, which is going to create more stability. But then from there, rolling onto the inside of the ball of your foot, you can push off in any direction laterally or on an angle if you want to go 45 degrees forward or back in either direction. Plus, from there, you can, if you need to, go forward or back, which is the two most common ways you will go. You can then quickly switch into a split stance so that one foot's in front of the other, and then you're in a 2-point start sort of position, which again, Jared Kay talked about on his episode, getting into that 2-point start position, which is where you've just got 2 points of contact on the ground. This is both your feet, no hands. A 3-point start position would be with one hand on the ground. 4-point start position, both hands on the ground, along with the 2 feet, obviously. So getting into that position is going to be the first step to moving fast in any direction. The pogos are the most foundational plyometric exercise you can do, and one of the best ways to develop speed and explosiveness. So you've got the strength training that you're doing. I'll talk about some of the exercises that you'll do for the quads and the hamstrings and glutes and so on, which are all really important, as well as the lower leg muscles. But right now, with the pogos, what you're doing by being up on the ball of your foot with your toes up and spread, actually by lifting your toes and spreading them, that creates tension in all the muscles in the lower leg in the front and anteriorly. Those muscles, that muscle in particular, is your tibialis anterior. So your seated running tib raises, tib being a short term for tibialis anterior. You've also got your tibialis posterior, which, side note, is usually the muscle which gets tight which then leads to shin splints. There's some other exercises you can do for that, but the tibialis anterior is the bigger muscle in the lower leg at the front, and that is responsible essentially for braking or decelerating, and also by extension changing direction, because when you're changing direction, what you need to do is you need to decelerate in order to change direction. You can't change direction 100%. There has to be some element of decelerating in order to change direction. So the tibialis anterior muscle is super important for decelerating, which is really important for injury prevention, because if you can't decelerate, then you're really at risk of injury and also changing direction. And so the first exercise, as I just touched on, was the seated running tib raises. You've then got the standing tib raises, which is where you stand 1 foot away from a wall so that your feet are about a foot length away from the wall, leaning against the wall, and then with your toes up in the top of your shoes and spread, you're pulling your toes back towards your shins. And then the next one is the weighted tib raises, where you're typically hanging a kettlebell over your toes, or you're strapping a dumbbell to the bottom of your foot with some form of like yoga strap or something. And developing that tibialis anterior strength is really important for the decelerating and changing direction, but it's also going to help you with that dorsiflexion of the foot. And dorsiflexion is lifting the toe up towards the shin. Super important in running mechanics when it comes to any form, whether it's accelerating, top end speed, decelerating, changing direction. So with the tibialis, with the toes pulled up from there to give us the activity, that tension in the tibialis anterior, the front of the lower legs and the foot. From there, on the ball of your foot, heel as low to the ground as possible without touching the ground, knees locked, hips locked, core tense and strong, switched on, ready to get a punch in the gut. So everything is locked and strong, bouncing and maintaining everything locked there. Those pogos doing that, probably I start off with 15 seconds and we do 3 rounds of that. So 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off, three rounds. You almost can't do too much of this. And what a coach said to me and what I've kind of typically followed is do as much pogos as you can possibly handle before you start to get sore and tender. If you're starting to get sore and tender in the shins, then that's a nice sign to go, okay, starting to push it too much, let's drop it back. And you just take a break for a day or 2 days or even a week, and then you get back into it and build that up. But if you can, the more pogos you can do, the more fast and explosive you are going to become. So pushing the envelope as much as possible is going to be beneficial, but using that pain and tenderness as a guide, not going into it, but as soon as you start to feel it, you're not injuring yourself, you're just starting to feel it. If you continue, you will injure yourself. But pushing that envelope to that point and then dropping back and go, okay, there's my point. Finding that point is really beneficial in maintaining or in maximizing your performance. However, you don't have to do that. You might just do what I prescribe, which is the 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off on 3 times, for 3 sets every day. And trying to do that as much as possible then is going to be key. If that's too much, if that ends up creating pain and tenderness, then you do what I say and you drop back. You have a day off, see how you feel. You might do some stretching, some self-massage, maybe even some icing or even some ice massage. And then from there, you then pick it back up and you build back up again, using your own body as your guide. But in doing that, in my experience, typically most people can handle 3 sets of 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off. And then we build that up to 30 seconds, 45 seconds, 60 seconds. You can even continue if you like. But the purpose for this is to really develop that strength in the tendons of the lower leg and the foot. And the tendon in particular that we're developing is the Achilles tendon. And the Achilles tendon is the one at the lower part of the back of the leg, and it attaches the calf muscles down to the bottom of the foot from behind. So the tendons don't actually get bigger when you strengthen them like a muscle does. If we do bicep curls and we do more and more and more of it, then what's going to happen is the muscle is going to become noticeably bigger. Tendons don't become noticeably bigger, but they become thicker. And the thicker and more dense your tendons are with fiber, with the fibers that make them up, the more powerful they're going to be. Think of a spring coil in a car. If it's easy to push down, it's going to not push back with as much force in the opposite direction when it's let go. If a coil is harder to compress, it's going to spring back with much more force. And so this is the same thing with tendons. The thicker and more dense they are with the tissues that make them up, the harder they're going to be to compress, which means that they require more force through them in order to compress them. But then when they recoil, they're going to recoil with much more force. And so tendons typically take about 7 months to remodel. They can remodel in as little as 2 months, But muscles, on the other hand, typically take about 3 months to remodel, and change can occur after about a week. So when you look at that muscles changes occurring after about a week, and typically really noticeable change after 3 months, whereas tendons are 2 months to see any real change and 7 months to completely sort of remodel, then you can see that this takes time. And when the preseason goes for 6 months, you can see how it really is going to take that entire 6 month preseason to see any real benefit in the tendon strength, particularly of the Achilles tendon, which is so key to running fast. So doing pogos is the number one exercise for developing tendon strength in the lower legs, in particular the Achilles tendon. And as I said, stick to the 15 seconds on, 15 seconds off for 3 sets to begin with. Try and do that every day and use pain and tenderness as a guide. And if that's too much, then drop it back, have some time off, and then get back into it and start slowly build up to that point again. Hey, Jacob here with a quick message. If you're enjoying this episode of the Women's Footy Podcast and you want more fitness tips for the female footballer, I encourage you to join our Instagram channel, Footy Fit Fam. Link is in the show notes. Now, back to the show. The muscles that we need to strengthen for developing speed and explosiveness are going to be obviously the lower leg muscles. We still need to focus on the upper body stuff because you need to have a strong upper body if you want to run fast. It is impossible for your legs to go any faster than your arms. Try it one day. It's impossible. You'll look really funny, but you'll probably have fun and a good laugh doing it. And certainly the people that are watching you do it on the oval will have a good laugh anyway, or wonder what's going on. So you need to have a strong upper body in order to run fast. You look at all the American and the Jamaican sprinters, and they're massive in their upper body. Their deltoids are huge. They're so big that they're usually coming up first before they then come out and down. They don't just come straight out. Their deltoids are popping at the top. So the deltoid is the muscle at the top of the upper arm, at the side of the upper arm. And the deltoid muscle is really important for being able to run fast. Same as the pecs and the upper back muscles, so that you can drive your arms. And the more you drive your elbow back, the more your opposite knee will pop up at the front. And so then you can create more force when you push your foot down to hit the ground. From there, we need to strengthen the core, obviously. We need to have a strong core, but getting the pelvis into that position that I talked about where we're posteriorly tilting it, sometimes in the beginning, overcompensating and really trying to tip water out the back, but ultimately settling in that neutral position where the pelvis is sitting flat, where there's no water spilling out the front or the back. And so that requires strength in the core, particularly the transverse abdominis, which is the body's flat stomach muscle. It keeps everything sort of tight and protected. It's kind of like the body's natural corset. The rectus abdominis is important. It's not as important as the transverse, in my opinion. It's really good for crunching, so it's good for doing sit-ups. But when it comes to running mechanics, the real important one is the transverse abdominis and having that nice and strong to maintain that stability as a platform for the feet to hit the ground and bounce off the ground and maximize that force going into the ground. From there, we need to have strong hip flexors. In my experience, a lot of people are kind of unknowingly lazy in their hip flexors. So once you start to run and you look at running mechanics, which we do that in the Footy Fit program, we analyze running mechanics. One of the things that people really need to work on is getting their hip flexors to be sort of more active. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff, and that's a whole nother topic. But having strength in the hip flexors to be able to do that is going to be really important. From there, our quads are important for running fast, particularly around the knee, in order to give the knee strength. The hamstrings are really important, and so are the lower legs. So in the lower legs, I've already mentioned at the front, the tibialis anterior. I've already mentioned the tibialis posterior, which sits in behind that, which is sort of on the inside of the shin bone. And then you've got the two at the back in the lower leg, and that is your gastrocnemius and your soleus. Your gastrocnemius is the muscle further back in the lower leg, and that is going to be targeted when you do straight-legged calf raises. So when your legs are straight, that's targeting the gastrocnemius. When your knees are bent, whether you're doing a seated calf raise or I call it a knees over toes calf raise because you're standing but you're trying to push your knees out past your toes, maybe because you don't have a seated calf raise machine. And these are often good to begin with because you can do them with body weight. Then the seated calf raise or the bent knee calf raise is targeting the soleus. And the soleus is really important. Often, I've already touched on tibialis posterior being related to shin splints. The soleus is often the one which is really over-tight or overused, leading to shin splints. So the soleus and the tibialis posterior are the two muscles, and I can talk about this on another episode, talking about reducing your risk for developing shin splints or overcoming shin splints. Those two muscles, the soleus and the tibialis posterior, are super important for shin splints. So, and preventing them or getting rid of them. You've got the gastrocnemius, which is a straight-legged one, and that's going to be important for running along with the soleus. So you need to be strong because you need those muscles to be able to contract. Now, what happens is typically those calf muscles take about 0.25 of a second to maximally contract. 0.25 of a second. Now, how much time does someone spend on the ground? An elite sprinter or a really good sprinter, an elite sprinter is even faster, but a really, really good sprinter is going to spend about 0.11 of a second on the ground. So that's 0.11. A long distance runner is going to spend 0.12 of a second on the ground. So that's 0.12. The sprinter, 0.11. And a long distance runner, 0.12. So you can see it is minuscule, the difference between a sprinter and a long distance runner in what they spend on the ground. It is only 0.01 of a second difference. So 0.01, checking that I've in my head that I've got that right, of a second difference. So it's minuscule. The difference comes in the power that they put into the ground, how hard they hit the ground. A sprinter is going to, at top end speed, lift their knee higher in order to drive their foot down with more force, hit the ground harder, and then propel them up and forward. A long distance runner doesn't need to hit the ground as hard because they don't need to go as fast. And for them, the priority is about conserving energy. So they don't need to be wasting that energy, lifting the knee higher and hitting the ground harder. But the difference between the two is minuscule, as I said, 0.01 of a second between the two in what they spend on the ground. So an elite sprinter is spending about 0.08 of a second on the ground. In order to break the world record, which currently sits with Usain Bolt, I think it is at like 9.78 or something, whatever it is, it's ridiculously fast. In order to get faster, what researchers are saying is that you need to improve that time on the ground and get off the ground faster. And so there was this really cool YouTube video that kind of tracked it with when it should be achieved based on like the rate at how everything kind of progresses and has progressed over history in terms of breaking the world record. And so they reckon that it should be broken around 2040. But the main thing is getting off the ground quicker. So the next step for sprinters is getting to that 0.07 of a second on the ground. So getting to that time, that's at the elite of the elite. That's the top, that's the Olympic level, world championship level. For most really good sprinters, as I said, it's 0.11 of a second on the ground. And some of you may be around that, some may be a little bit slower than that, but that's generally for really good sprinters. So with that, I've just said that the calf muscle takes 0.25 of a second to maximally contract, which means that when you hit the ground, your calf muscle is not getting a maximal contraction. So the calf muscle is not doing a full contraction when you are top end speed sprinting, when you're running at top speed. So that says to us that the calf muscle should be doing some form of an isometric contraction at the same time. There's going to be some concentric and eccentric. The difference is concentric contraction is shortening of the muscle, eccentric is lengthening, isometric is contracting but no movement, no shortening, no lengthening, it just stays at the same length. So the calf muscle is just essentially bracing to keep everything locked and loaded, ready to run fast. The work is coming through the tendon, and in particular, the Achilles tendon. You get that stretch, shorten cycle reflex, and then that then propels you forward. So that's why pogos are so important. But to develop the muscles to be able to handle all of that, to allow the Achilles to do what it needs to do, it is super important. So you still need to strengthen your lower leg muscles. So by strengthening your gastrocnemius with straight-legged calf raises, your soleus with bent knee calf raises, as well as the tibialis anterior for that tension in the foot when you're lifting your foot up in a dorsiflex position in running mechanics, as well as to be able to decelerate and change direction. You need to strengthen those three muscles, and you should be doing that through full end range strength. So taking the muscle out to its end range and then maximally contracting it. So that's going to give you that foundation to protect the Achilles to do what it needs to do, as well as protect those muscles that are experiencing massive amounts of load every time your foot hits the ground. So from there, let's move up into the quads and the hamstrings. The quads, we do everything that we can do for the quads. The quads are made up of 4 muscles, hence the word quadricep, quad. And so in that, anything where you're taking your knee out past your toe is going to target more the VMO muscle, vastus medialis oblique, which is the teardrop looking muscle at the lower part of the quad on the inside, just above the knee. And then normal sort of barbell back squats, belt squats, where you got your heel on the ground going down, is sort of a bit more the lateral part of the quad and the bigger part of the quad in more generally, but incorporating different types of squatting, barbell back squatting, front squatting, which is going to really help you for later on when you want to be doing like cleans and snatches, which are really good power exercises when you want to really get that explosiveness and speed at the later parts of the season, as well as different lunges, the knees over toes lunges, the sissy squats, which is the squats where you're taking your knees out past your toes, and all those different variations are super important for having nice strong quads, which are going to help you run faster. And doing the knees over toes stuff, for example, the heels elevated barbell back squats, the sissy squats, the knees over toes lunges are all going to develop that VMO muscle, which is really important for speed and explosiveness. So the more you can strengthen that VMO muscle, which is where you're taking your knees out past your toes, the more explosiveness you're going to have, because you're going to have more power because of the fast twitch muscle fibers in those muscles. Then lastly, actually not lastly, I haven't even touched on the glutes. The hamstrings, as I've already said, there's 3 different types of muscle contraction: the concentric, eccentric, isometric. The hamstrings, essentially, while they are elements in good running mechanics of concentric and eccentric contraction in running, the hamstrings are essentially doing an isometric contraction similar to the calf muscles, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. So the hamstring needs to essentially lock, release, in good running mechanics. And so what we need to do there is strengthen the hamstrings up isometrically, but we really need to still, like with all the muscles, do concentric and eccentric as well. So concentric stuff is shortening of the hamstrings. Eccentric stuff is going to be things like slide board lowers and so on, lengthening stuff. The Nordics on that, by the way. So you've got your deadlifts, you've got your sumo deadlifts, which are really good strengthening exercises for the hamstrings, particularly concentrically, so shortening. You've got your RDLs, your Romanian deadlifts. So these are your real big heavy lifts that are really going to be effective for your lower back, glutes, hamstrings, and hamstrings in particular. Then you've got your single leg stuff, which might be like a landmine RDL, so hanging onto a barbell on one side, single leg RDLs with a kettlebell or a dumbbell. You can start these off with a B stance or a split stance type position where you've got both feet on the ground, but you've got one foot in front of the other. So it's a split stance. So you're targeting the front leg, but you've got that balance and stability with the other leg on the ground. Moving into a full single leg where you're lifting the back leg up off the ground and then requiring that stability through that single leg. Going into then even like your Jefferson curls, which are going to be really good for your lower back, but then getting that lengthening in the hamstrings, that really end range strength stuff. Your eccentric stuff, which is a lot of like the Nordic stuff. So with the Nordics, I like to do Nordic lowers, which with Nordic lowers, you're targeting your lower hamstring. And then you've got your Harrop curls, which are a similar exercise where you're hinging at the hips, which targets your upper hamstring. So Nordics typically target more the lower hamstring, Harrop curls more the upper hamstring, and then you can move into a more advanced version, which is the razor curl, which is a combination of both. But you don't move into the razor curl until you are really proficient and competent with the Nordic, and you can get down to at least sort of like 45 degrees level. So I often prescribe at the early parts of a season in preseason, the Nordics and the Harrop curls to build that ability up. And if you can do 6 months of that, you may have a chance of getting onto the razor curls in season, but it's going to take you a long time to develop that. But that's your eccentric stuff. As I've already touched on, the single leg slide board lowers or even double leg slide board lowers, which is a really good eccentric exercise. You've got a whole bunch of stuff with the back extension machine. So for example, now we're moving into the isometric stuff where you might just be in a back extension machine holding that position. You may have something in your hands where you're doing some more explosive stuff like a sandbag or a plate, and you're pushing that away from you to create that kind of like force away from you, twisting, even doing that stuff. These are all more advanced exercises, but then you've got your more simple ones where you're developing isometric strength, where you're laying on your back and you're doing a double leg to begin with, long lever, isometric hold. So you're just sliding your feet out. You may even have a short lever, which just means that your feet are in close to your bum to begin with. You go up into what is typically known as a bridge position. Then you might go into a long lever where you walk your feet away from your hips, and so your legs are extended. Then you move into your single leg stuff and doing that single leg. So isometric exercises actually have an analgesic effect. So they give you a bit of a sense of like numbing of the muscle. So I like to do them at the end of a workout, but they're great to do. And typically, if you can do 5 to 7 seconds, then that's probably the best time frame for doing them. There's at different times of the season, we'll do different lengths. We may do stuff where we're up on a bench and maybe even working like the inner leg, where whether it's short lever or long lever, and we go for up to like 30 seconds. There's times we might only do 3 seconds, but typically 5 to 7 seconds is a really good time frame for developing isometric strength with any muscle. But developing isometric strength in the hamstrings is super important, and I see not enough people doing it. They do a lot of deadlifts, they do leg curls. Leg curl is actually another example of like a concentric exercise for the hamstrings. You can turn it into a bit more of an eccentric focus by doing double leg up and then single leg down. That's a great exercise. We start off in preseason with double leg up, double leg down to develop that concentric eccentric. Then we move into the double leg up, single leg down. And then it's sometimes even single leg up, single leg down. But you can get a lot of good work in with the double leg up, single leg down and really get like good eccentric strength in the hamstrings. People do these, but then they fail to understand the importance of the isometric stuff, and isometric stuff for the hamstring is so super important. Starting off with short lever to begin with, so feet in close, and then moving into long lever once you've developed that competence. So there's so much to it when it comes to developing speed and explosiveness. As you can see, it comes down to strength, and it comes down to a really well professionally designed high performance program that is thought out so that you can progress through the varying levels of competence to get you to peak come finals time. So doing preseason is just so, so valuable. But as you can see, strength underpins running mechanics. And then from there, you've got your conditioning. So it's no good just going out and just doing sprint training. Yes, you should be doing that, but you need to have the strength that's going to underpin what you're asking of your body. When it then comes to the conditioning, starting off with shorter distances to begin with is better practice, because you can then reduce your risk for injury. Going straight into 40-meter sprints, for example, is going to increase your risk for injury than if you were to start with 10-meter sprints. And I like to, in preseason phase 1, 10-meter sprints, and then we then progress into 20-meter, 30-meter, 40-meter, so that we really develop the capacity in the muscles to handle that sprinting that we're doing. And by the way, you should be doing sprinting at 95% effort or above, so 95 to 100% every single week of the year, in my opinion. And every strength and conditioning coach I've interviewed on the podcast so far has said the same thing, that sprint training should be incorporated once a week at every point in the season. So when it comes to sprint training, starting with shorter distances to begin with to develop that capacity and then extending that out. You can even play around with things like resistance bands, where you put a resistance band around somebody to kind of hold them back a little bit and get someone to hold them kind of like a horse and cart, holding onto that resistance band. Please don't let it go. And then go along with them. You get pulled along. So you need someone who's probably about the same speed as you or faster. get them to hold it, and then they don't necessarily need to be, but they certainly can't be too slow because you do not want them letting go of that band. I've never seen it happen, and I don't want to. But having that band around them is then going to slow them up so they're still getting that force. And it's something that I sometimes do like to use in early parts of preseason, just so that people aren't, just to hold back that rule. So they're still giving that 95 to 100% effort, but they're not getting that 95 to 100% output, which is just going to protect their muscles a little bit when they're just sort of getting into that sprint training. So when it comes to designing a sprint training program, in terms of work to recovery, it's best to work on, for every 10 meters, take 30 to 60 seconds rest. So if it's 10 meters, 30 seconds is probably enough. You want at least 30 seconds rest in between each rep to recover, or 60 seconds, somewhere between 30 and 60 seconds. It's probably at the beginning, it's probably better to go more 60, to have that more rest. But then as the distances are coming a little bit longer, you can probably bring it in just in terms of time management for a session, because you're possibly doing other stuff in the session as well, so that you can not be there all day. So let's just say, for example, 10-meter sprint, 60-second rest. We move out to 20 meters. So we double that, 2 minutes rest in between each one. Then we move out to 30 meters, 3 minutes rest between each one. And that's where I'd probably play around with it and sort of come in a little bit. So 40 meters, you could have 4 minutes, you could have 2 minutes. So anywhere, as I said, 30 to 60 seconds rest for every 10 meters of running. So for every 10 meters of running, you're having 30 to 60 seconds of rest. So 40 meters, that's 4 lots of 10 meters of running. So 30 to 60 seconds would be 4 minutes at the 1 minute period, and 2 minutes at the 30-second period. So anywhere between 2 and 4 minutes recovery. Actually, probably, now I'm trying to remember what I have in the program. I actually think it's 1 minute up until the 60-meter mark. So we have 5 minutes for 50 meters and 6 minutes for 60 meters. And at that point, we're not really accelerating anymore anyway. That's just an acceleration focus for a sprint session. We move into our top end speed stuff. And our top end speed stuff is focusing on accelerating over a certain distance, holding that top end speed for a certain distance, and decelerating for a certain distance. And developing deceleration is just as important as acceleration. And I'll leave you with that. So if there's any questions on any of this, please send me a message on Instagram at Jacob_Andre. I love answering your questions. It could even become a podcast episode one day. Send us an email, info@jacobandre.com. And I'd love to know what your questions are about this and what you'd love to know more about. And if you've got a topic for the podcast that you would like me to talk about, then please shoot. I know there's been a lot of information in this episode simply talking about speed and explosiveness, but this has come from my 20 plus years of experience in education as well as on the field practice. And I know a lot about this stuff, and there is actually a lot that goes into it to, 1, maximize your speed, and 2, reduce your risk for injury. So actually, one last thing I'm going to leave you with, the best strengthening exercise is sprinting. So when some research was done on muscle activation in the hamstrings, the best strength exercise for the hamstrings. So the hamstrings, there's more muscle activation in the hamstrings when sprinting than in any of the other strength exercises. And the next best exercise is the Nordics. So, and sprinting is twice as good as that. So yes, it is important to sprint, but you need to do it sensibly. You need to do your strength that's going to underpin your body's ability to be able to sprint. So just because sprinting is the best strengthening exercise for the hamstrings, and there's more muscle activation in the hamstrings when sprinting, doesn't mean that you just go and sprint and don't do any strength exercise, because you need to build capacity in the muscles, not just the hamstrings, but all the muscles, as well as, I even forgot the glutes. See, there's so much to it. Hip thrust for the glutes, but you're getting the glutes in the deadlifts and the RDLs as well. Glutes, big, massive, powerful muscle, the biggest muscle in the body, and super important for driving the foot down to hit the ground. So much to it. But if I can leave you with one thing, it is pogos. Yes, do the strength program, do one that's sensible, do the sprinting each week. Start off with smaller distances to begin with, even with a resistance band around you to slow you up to begin with, for safety, to prevent any injury. And once you're done, as you're doing all of that, as you're doing your strength, which is, all your strength of the muscles, you're doing your conditioning with your sprint training in the sensible way that I've talked about, you're working on your running mechanics to get everything aligned and moving mechanically efficiently. The best exercise is the pogos, and I highly recommend those pogos every single day as much as possible, and stay within that period, that point where you're not experiencing any pain and tenderness. So pogos are it. Strength training, super important as part of the pogos, and then the sprint training comes from there. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode. It feels like so much, but as I said, send me a message if you've got any questions on it so that I can probably clarify what I'm saying on any areas. But thank you for joining me on this week's episode of the women's. I was going to say the Mind Your Body again. It's been so long. I started the Mind Your Body podcast in 2017, and sometimes I still slip back into that subconsciously. This is the Women's Footy podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Are you a footballer who wants to maximize your performance to succeed at the top level? My new ebook, Strength and Conditioning 101 for Female Footballers, is now available. For free and instant access, simply head on over to jacobandre.com. Link is in the show notes.